Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of The Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Vassilis Saroglou. He is full professor of psychology at the UCL-Louvain in Belgium, with expertise in psychology of religion, personality, social and cross-cultural psychology, moral psychology, and the psychology of positive emotions. So, Dr. Saroglou, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Ricardo.
So today we're going to focus our interview on religion. And I've already talked about religion on the show several times. I mean, it's one of the topics I explore the most, I think. But it was mostly done with anthropologists and neuroscientists. So tell us first, from the perspective of psychology, what is religion or religiosity?
Typically, when we think from a very, let's say, American perspective, we think of religion as search for meaning, beliefs, meaning system. That's true, but that's only one aspect of religion. Religion means not only cognitive processes, but also emotional processes, then rituals. So we have beliefs, meaning on the one side, but also emotions and rituals. Third, we have morality, or at least a need for righteousness, being correct in everything you are doing. And the fourth dimension is belonging to a community, to a group that has the perception that it has a prestigious history and it will have an eternal past. So these four dimensions that I have called in one paper believing, which in continuation of previous research, of course, by others, believing, bonding with others and God through rituals, behaving morally correctly, and belonging. So these four B's are necessary to define religion. If we don't have these four and we have only two or three, this is something similar, but not clearly religion. So you may have philosophy, you may have existential questions, you may have just ritual for fun or for to enter in the second year of the university, but that's not religion. Religion, you need all the four elements, of course, in reference to a transcendence.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you now, just to set the stage, let's say, about some two distinctions that you talk about in your work. So first of all, between intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity. So what's that distinction about?
Yeah, that's a classic distinction in psychology of religion back in the late 60s, I think, or early 60s. And it comes from mainstream psychology of motivation. The idea is that you do things in life because you are intrinsically motivated, so you are doing sport because really you like sport and the benefits of sport. So the same for religion, because you like faith, spirituality, the experiences there. Or you have an extrinsic motivation, you are doing something for other reasons. For instance, you are doing sport because you want to meet a partner in the garden, or where you are doing jogging, or for religion you practice or you go to church just to make friends or to have voters if you are a politician, etc. So that has been a classic distinction that has some relevance, I would say. But today, let's say, we try a bit to abandon that for two reasons. First, because again, there was a kind of American ethnocentrism there in the idea that only intrinsic religion is good, extrinsic is bad, and then you have Judaism or, for instance, Orthodox Christian world, where the ritual is very important. If you don't practice well, you are not a good Christian, something like that. And the second reason is that in secular countries, in the secular Western European countries, at least today, there is no more reason to be religious for extrinsic reasons, mainly. So more and more people who remain religious, who are or become religious, it's for intrinsic motivations. And that changes a bit the picture.
And what about the distinction between devotional religion and coalitional religion?
Yeah, that's colleagues of mine that have, let's say, had this nice theorization. If I remember well, it was Hansen and Rosayan back in 2007, 6 in a paper. So they summarize in that way a variety of forms, religious forms. And I like the idea because across all models of classification of religious forms, that makes sense to say, okay, there are two dimensions. You have the individual dimension, that is it's more, let's say, prayer. You are individually in contact with God, with faith, with spirituality, etc. And this individual part is more the devotional part of religion. But all religions till today have also the social part, the institutional part, the group, the collective part. So this is the two parts, so the individual, the devotional, and the coalitional are inherent to religion. Now that has been, let's say, classic. What we see today, of course, more and more is that people, let's say, privilege or like more, invest more on the individual part, the devotional part, and this approach is what we today perceive as spirituality. And then there is the idea that the religion is bad, and then at least it's a bit old stuff, and then it's, let's say, outdated because it represents this institutional and coalitional dimension. Why coalitional? Because there is the idea that you are an in-group, you like the others in the in-group, but then, of course, you make a coalition against others or being indifferent with regard to others. And in a universalistic, let's say, ethic perspective, this is not very much appealing to believers or to spiritual people.
Mm-hmm. From a psychological perspective, does it make sense to distinguish between religiosity and spirituality? And if so, what would be that distinction?
I like the idea you say from a psychological perspective, because theoretically we can conceptualize many things, but psychologically first there is an overlap. Okay, it's not so clear that people are very spiritual and they hate religion. No, and if you see the data across studies, it's clear there is some correlation. People who are more religious versus non-religious, they tend also to be more spiritual than non-spiritual. Now, there are two ways to see the issue. So historically, if we think in terms of traditional religious perspective, spirituality was part of religion. So if you take even theology, you have spirituality as the kind of the internal part of your internal actions with regard to your emotions, your ideas, etc. And this internal work, that's spirituality within religion. But that's a bit, let's say, traditional. Today, more and more emphasis is given to spirituality as a kind of post-religious attitude, I would say. And then we see some similarities in terms of personality, but also we see some differences. And the big difference is, of course, that spirituality is much more individualized as an approach, so it's not coalitional. You are more independent or totally independent from religious tradition, religious institution, etc. But you share with traditional religion this need for connectedness with others and this motivation to value compassion, prosociality, and of course belief in a transcendence. Then everything has meaning, destiny. There is some reason why we are here, etc. And that's also common. I would say, that would be a bit the similarities and differences between the two today. But then this way to see things applies at the moment only in Western secular countries. In traditional religious countries, the separation between modern spirituality and traditional religiosity has not yet arrived.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you now a little bit about religious fundamentalism and what characterizes it psychologically. So what is it, and when it comes to its psychology, are there, for example, specific personality traits, conservative or liberal social or political attitudes, and cognitive and emotional needs that push people toward religious fundamentalism?
Yeah. From the believer's perspective, you have two positions. If you are a fundamentalist, you say, I'm religious like the others, even I am better religious people. If you are not fundamentalist, you may have the perception that, that's not religion, that's not me, my religion is not fundamentalist. So psychological is a very interesting question. what are the commonalities between mere religiosity, common religiosity, so religious belief practice, and fundamentalism? And I would say, yes, it's a bit like, it's not something other. So fundamentalism, of course, it's more intense religion, but it also represents more specific needs. Not totally different, but in a more intense way, in a more extreme, perhaps, way. So cognitive needs, clearly, need for certainty, intolerance of ambiguity, and then this results on dogmatism and inflexibility in your beliefs. Mm-hmm. In terms of emotional needs, clearly, research shows that there is association between fundamentalism and negative emotionality, guilt, obsessionality, kind of inherent feeling that something is very wrong with the world and myself, something like that. And then third, in terms of morality, there is this kind of excessive thirst for purity. And you need to be clean for everything. Mm-hmm. That's obsessionality. And in terms of identity, because previously we spoke of coalitional religion, then it becomes not only very strong identification with your in-group, but also very negative attitudes about the out-group. And mm-hmm. then almost, let's say, certainly feeling of superiority and perhaps discrimination of the out-groups. So a question we recently asked in our research is, are there different forms of fundamentalism? You can imagine a cognitive fundamentalism as a cognitive dogmatism, or fundamentalism as a excessive obsessionality of purity and morality, or as a very negative religiosity. And what we found is that all these components contribute to fundamentalism. And that seems to be a bit universal across religious cultures. Yeah, that seems a bit universal. So conceptually, we can imagine that people are only dogmatic without being, let's say, guilty, without feeling guilt, or they can be just conservative without being fundamentalist in terms of dogmatism. But empirically, all these 3-4 aspects go together. Yeah, so mm-hmm. That's it's a system. Then you cannot resolve easily fundamentalism by just making people feel a bit happier. Huh? So it's much more structural stuff.
Mm-hmm. And talking about emotions, there's also a distinction between religious orientations that are marked by positive emotionality and joy, for example, and also religious orientations more marked by negative emotionality, like anxiety, fear, guilt, etc. Correct?
More than 100 years ago, William James already make the distinction between, let's say, religiosity marked by, he called that six owl. So you are really feeling that the evil is everywhere, and then the world is really dominated by evil, and then you have to fight, and then it's more like Kierkegaard, I would say. Yeah, there is a kind of melancholy about the human existence. And then there is also the other form, as you mentioned, a kind of naive happiness. Then you are positively oriented to everything, love, benevolence, trust everybody, etc. So the two are present, and empirically, yes, globally we cannot say religion is more the one or the other, because mm-hmm. the two personality tendencies are there, and let's say from both sides people find something interesting in religion and to mm-hmm. be attached to religion. You may, let's say, think always about devil and last judgment after your death, or you may feel always happy about the paradise and then the connection with God. So the two are there together. Now, very, very recently, and this is unpublished because I have no time to rewrite to make the revision, but we found that this difference also applies to cultures. So you may have religious cultures where religion translates more this kind of negative emotionality, guilt, anxiety, shame, etc. And then you have some religious cultures that are more, especially, of course, the American culture, even the American fundamentalism in some cases, exceptional cases, more marked by this joyfulness and then optimism that things will go always better and are good inherently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would like next to ask you about what is psychologically distinct between believers and non-believers. But just before we get into that, I have another question. So when it comes to studying religion scientifically, what is it that fundamentalist religious people and anti-theistic non-religious people or anti-theistic atheists get wrong about it? Because I mean, I think that they get some things wrong about how religion should be approached scientifically. Correct.
Um, let's say in general, no. That means everybody is right or has the right to think what he or she likes about religion. So I don't have a problem with that. In research, let's say in psychological research, of course, sometimes, let's say the researchers, before of their own attitudes, they have, let's say, their stereotypes about what should be or should not be psychology of religion, or even whether this field should exist or not. So, of course, if you are a fundamentalist, you don't like often the results from psychology of religion, because sometimes there are negative results, and then you have to question yourself. Now, throughout my experience of 25 years of reviewing and reading, and especially reviewing or being reviewed by others, it's amazing. Of course, you may have the same data results. So the fundamentalists will say, goodness, your negative results about religion is because you didn't measure religiousness well. And then the fanatic atheists, let's say, as reviewers, will try to say, no, there is nothing about religion. All this is an artifact of your measures, and there is nothing unique about religion. So just forget. There is no reason to study it. That's the kind of situation in the research. But okay, but means that's very marginal. So the field continues, and the solution, of course, is when you have many labs, many laboratories across countries that study things, and then they have convergent evidence, then you are sure that all these, let's say, ideological stereotypes in the mind of fanatically pro-religious or fanatically anti-religious, even scholars, are put on the margin, and then, let's say, research and science advances. Never mind people's,
So, but why are there believers and non-believers? What are the psychological differences between them?
Yeah. First, it's amazing when we realize that there always have been believers and non-believers. Even in very religious countries, you have always people, they may practice because of social pressure, okay? But when they are there, they don't believe. They are obliged to say prayers or to play the game. But, okay, they are non-believers, let's say, in their interior. And today, of course, we can, even in very, very, very secular countries, you always have religious people, and if not religious people, in the traditional way of thinking, you have spiritual people, as I said before, like a kind of post-religious, let's say, attitude. Now, why there are both of them? First, of course, it's tradition, socialization, education. You can imagine that if people have been religiously educated versus atheistically educated, this has some impact, of course. But most importantly, there are personality differences. So if you have a certain personality profile or characteristics, and if you have certain values preferences, there is more chance to be or remain or become religious, versus there are more chances if you have other kind of priorities in values or other personality characteristics, there is more chance to become atheist or to remain atheist. And it seems, yes, that the world has always been plenty of believers and plenty of atheists, and perhaps there is some reason for that. Perhaps both of them, let's say, or both attitudes have functions that have been, let's say, perhaps useful for society or for human beings. For the history.
But when it comes to those personality traits, do we know what they are?
Yeah. If we take the classic now, it became classic because it's 25 years now or 30, but let's say now the classic dominant model of big five traits of personality, clearly religiosity correlates with the factor called agreeableness, that means being nice, kind, empathetic, prosocial, or at least having this disposition. This does not mean that necessarily in every moment you will be prosocial, sacrificial, altruistic, but you have this kind of disposition to be oriented to others and have this kind of perspective taking. So that's one important characteristic, and it seems universal across culture, across religions. So the size of the effect may be bigger or smaller, but this is totally universal. And second is the less strong or less universal, but still it is pretty present, conscientiousness. Another personality characteristic, that means you want order in your life, in your internal and external life. So there is this kind of inhibited aspect of conscientiousness, not impulsivity, for instance. But also you want to have goals, to succeed things, to not, let's say, die and then as if you did nothing in your life. You have to do something like that. So it's a kind of proactiveness. So these are the two main personality characteristics. If we take the other three of the big five that are extraversion, neuroticism, and openness to experience, then there is variability. That means religion attracts both open-minded and closed-minded people, both extraverted and non-extraverted, and as you say, you mentioned previously, people with neuroticism or people with emotional stability. So yeah, that's the personality characteristics. Yeah, so again, it's not black and white, but if I translate that in terms of probabilities, instead of 50-50, that means everything is possible, you may have 60-65% on the one side, 35 on the one side. So if you have, let's say, 100 of believers, you may have 65% who are agreeable. If you have atheists, you may have 35% of them who are agreeable. Yeah, so that's a bit the situation.
And in terms of psychology and particularly about cognition now, we hear frequently from atheists that religious people are less intelligent or have lower cognitive ability. But is that correct?
It's almost a tricky question because there are some empirical answers today, but they're a bit too global. So there has been a meta-analysis showing that yes, there is a negative effect of religiosity on intelligence, all aspects taken together. But then there was another paper that showed that most of the effect was due to education. This means that across the world, across countries, there is small effect of education. So the more you are educated, the less you may be religious. And this may be the explanatory factor behind this low intelligence effect. But first, the effect is first, there is this issue with education. Second, the effect is very small. It seems that it is 12 or 13 in terms of correlations. But most importantly, what it is clear, if we cut intelligence into different components, what it is clear is that there is an issue with what we call analytic thinking. What it is clearly characteristic of religiosity is the preference for intuitive thinking over analytic thinking. So analytic thinking is a kind of more scientific, rational, Aristotelian, I would say, or formal logic thinking. Intuitive thinking is a thinking that it is more associated with creativity, art, and implies the belief that things are interconnected, everything is interconnected, there are secret connections that we cannot even see, etc. So it's not non-intelligent because there are some research now in children, for instance, and adults showing the heuristic quality of intuitive thinking, but clearly in terms of what of the two ways of thinking is the more appropriate for scientific thinking, this is analytic thinking. So this is the clearest characteristic of cognitive style that characterizes more the religious people versus the atheist people, and less than a global, let's say, sense of intelligence. Yeah.
Right. And do we know why people convert to or deconvert from religion? So let's say that we have an atheist that converts to any sort of religion out there, or vice versa. We have a religious
Yeah.
person that becomes an atheist. Do we know why that happens?
Of course, we know more why how religious people deconvert. Sorry, no. There has been traditional research on conversion because for the, let's say, non-believer scientists, it was totally bizarre why people, let's say, one day they become religionists. So the conversion. And it is more recent, let's say, as a topic, why people who are secularized as atheists, they become religious in that way. Okay, I would say it's the same kind of processes, in fact. So if we take the 4Bs I mentioned before, the 4Bs apply cognitive needs, emotional needs, moral needs, and identity, social needs. So what happens here? In terms of cognitive development, cognitive maturation, you may one day discover that, okay, goodness, these dogmas, etc., are really bizarre. They don't have much sense, and then that's a reason, let's say, to take some distance from religion. Or at the opposite, your cognitive maturation may help you to say, okay, wow, there may be some spiritual flavor in life, in the world, etc. So that's the first example. Take now the emotional stuff. Emotional, especially relational insecurity, in particular regarding the attachment to parents, has been, let's say, the most striking and universal across studies and decades characteristic of religious conversion.
Yeah.
So if you are unhappy with your parents, let's say, even if you have been religiously educated, this is a reason to take some distance. But the same may be the case for atheists who want to be religious. If they have received an education with secularism, but there has been a secure attachment with the parents, again, they are also looking for more security, and God is a secure figure. Third, morality, the same, take the moral hypocrisy. So if you are a believer and then you see bad things in the church, etc., you say, goodness, what's going on here? You take your distance, you don't want to identify with a morally bad community.
Right.
But moral also issues may push non-believers to become religious. For instance, especially today, you may have, let's say, adolescents, young people who say, goodness, this society has become very much individualistic, very much materialistic, capitalism, etc., and they want something different. That's moral motivation to become religious. And to finish with the fourth aspect, the identity stuff again, if you want to belong to a prestigious community, etc., then you may convert to a religion that appears really fantastic, or a sectarian group that promise you salvation and glory, etc. Or at the opposite, perhaps if you want to broaden your in-group, etc., and have more universalistic identity by saying I'm citizen of the world, I suppose this helps more people to become atheists or non-believers by saying, wow, goodness, we are all in a big community in this world, and there is no reason to have this kind of religious distinctions between religious groups and different gods, etc. Yeah, I have been a bit long, but okay, I think it's amazing how the processes are pretty similar. It's the change, psychologically speaking, it's the change in terms of convictions that it is important, rather than the outcome, in fact. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So another question: there are people that argue that we and children even have a natural predisposition toward religiosity, that we are naturally inclined to believing in supernatural entities, gods, all of that. So do you think that there's good enough evidence to support that idea?
At the moment, let's say empirical research in the last 15 years goes to the two directions, and sometimes it comes from people who belong to the same laboratory in the beginning. It's amazing. So the one results where authors conclude that, okay, they're in favor of the natural inclination hypothesis, and other results clearly showing that no, everything is about education. If the society, your parents present you Santa Claus or God as real and ready to help you and giving you gifts, then you believe. If not, you don't believe. So empirically, that's what I can say. Now, both positions, at least, let's say, converge on the following: that religious beliefs are not unnatural or are not against, let's say, the psychology of childhood, something like that. So the religious beliefs, as they are, let's say, explicit taught by the adults, are welcomed by children, something like that. But this is not a direct proof or definitive proof on whether there is a natural inclination. For instance, there is a natural inclination for existential questions, to ask existential questions. That's clear. 4 or 5 years old, children say, well, what's going on here? My grandmom is dead. What's going on? But the answers cannot be surely taken as a kind of natural inclination. If you say, okay, there is a paradise, you can also probably answer by saying that's the end and there is nothing else. But of course, we can imagine it's a bit more hard to say that to a child. Yeah, that would be, let's say, at the moment, the situation on this. But it is a topic to be investigated more in the future, yeah.
So I would like to ask you now, or address two different stereotypes that people have, particularly about adolescents and old people. So is it really the case that adolescents are more prone toward rebellious behavior and becoming non-believers?
Yeah, let's say if we take the evidence goes in favor of this stereotype. But also this comes from, let's say, a period where societies were traditionally religious. So if you're adolescent, and the characteristic of adolescents, among others, is that openness to experience increases, exploration increase, impulsivity increase, sexual awareness increase, etc. And you come from a traditional religious family and you live in a traditional religious society. So your way to take reflection and to have a kind of self-criticism with respect to all this is, of course, to take some distance. So right. That has been the predominant pattern because of the predominant, let's say, past. Now, it is a new reality that has not yet been well investigated, but it seems that in secular countries you may have also, not in such an important degree, so it's a minority stuff, but you may have also the opposite pattern. As I mentioned a bit before, when I alluded to materialism, you may have some adolescents who are unsatisfied with materialism, capitalism, social injustice, or etc., and then they may, let's say, want to find something else, spirituality. So you have adolescents now who, at 12 years old, they ask to be baptized, for instance. So it's a new reality. But I would not put the two realities as numerically equal, clearly. It seems that the conversions not it seems, now I have seen that including our data, so it's pretty clear. Numerically speaking, the conversions of adolescents and young people in secular societies are a very small numerical reality. But it exists, yeah.
Right. And about the older people, are they really, or they tend to be bigots, as we usually think?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, what was the past? Traditional religious societies, literal understanding of heaven and hell, and also the longevity was not so high. So people, let's say, expected to die at 70, 75, etc. even. So in the past, that was a bit, let's say, this stereotype corresponded a bit to reality. Until now, there is some evidence that this is one major pathway. The more people age and approach, the more they approach the death, the more they ask this kind of questions. And it seems a bit more easy to say, okay, I will rediscover faith. And there is also, with regard to this pattern, another also process that we see in terms of nostalgia or coming back to the origin. If you remember, François Mitterrand, who was normally an atheist or a secularist, wanted to have a religious funeral in his village of origin, something like that, a kind of return to where I come from, something like that. Now, that's a traditional, let's say, still present pattern that corresponds to the stereotype you mentioned, but at the same time, human development, social development, moral development become much more complex. We say that in developmental psychology that there is no one direction. It is multi-trajectory, the process. The same with religion. So there are more and more cases now of people who, after they educate their children and they get some autonomy from family obligations, they realize that they have in front of them 20, 30 years, and they start a new life, taking also distance from religion, etc. So, yeah, it is multidirectional, as we say now. So you may have, and in Belgium in particular, because Belgium has been one of the first countries to legalize euthanasia, that has been a sensitive topic. So I presume that in cultures where euthanasia is not socially accepted or legalized, it's a bit more difficult. But in countries where this is legalized as accepted, it's more easy to imagine that life ends and that's all, and there is nothing to believe more than that.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask you now about the relationship between religiosity and altruism, because if I understand it correctly, it's a bit messy. I mean, there are researchers who say that there's clearly a link between being religious and being altruist, and others who dispute that. But I mean, of course, there are many religions out there that promote values of compassion, love, altruism, and all of that. But even if that's the case, does it really have an effect on people's behavior, and then religious people tend to be more altruistic, or is that just simply, something that religious people themselves say they believe, or the way they present themselves?
Yeah, you're right. It has been, I will not, but perhaps I'm not sure if it is a massy, but wow, I mean, people are passionate. I was happy because when I started as a professor in the early 2000s, it was my first project, in fact, religion and prosociality. So it was before it became, let's say, a hot topic, but then we had nice results, and happily it became a very mainstream topic. Mm-hmm. Let's say, I will really try to give the most strictly close to the data and the evidence answer.
Okay.
The opinion that there is nothing and there is only moral hypocrisy, and the religious people believe that they are compassionate, but in fact they are not different from others, this is excessive attitude that does not correspond to the data. Right? That they are just altruists in their mind and there is nothing there. That's extreme, and empirically it's not correct. Now, the opposite one, that, wow, it's so clear that the religion promotes prosociality, and that in general altruistic behavior is an outcome of religious faith and practice, that also excessive and extreme and does not correspond to data. What we first argue in 2005 in a paper that has been cited, let's say, several hundreds of times now, and all the evidence then, it's clear, it corresponds to this idea, is that there is some effect. So the religious people are not crazy when they say they try to be prosocial, or they believe that they are prosocial and they have prosocial values. Something remains if you go there. So they are not paranoid neither. But of course, it's not huge. It's not universal as an outcome. The behavior, it's not in every situation. So I have called that limited prosociality, minimal prosociality, and conditional prosociality. Mm-hmm. Why limited? Because it applies mostly to the in-group. So if you're a religious believer, you may be a bit more prone to forgive your close people, or to be more collaborative, etc. Will you like everybody, even your enemies? No, not necessarily. but at least you may be more helpful with regard to people you know. So limited prosociality to the in-group. Minimal, why minimal? Because it's low cost. But at the same time, it's like the glass, is it half empty or half full? As psychologists, we cannot expect people to be sacrificial and altruistic in every opportunity, in every situation, in every moment. So there is some effect of religiosity or religious priming on prosocial behavior. Sometimes, in some occasions, it's not so bad. Let's say, I would be happy if I have some neighborhoods who are sometimes more prosocial than not at all. So this is minimal. And third, it's conditional. That means it has not to be in opposition with other values or principles that in religious people's mind may be in opposition. So if it is to help your daughter, you will help her for different things. But if the daughter comes with, let's say if it's a Christian daughter and comes with a Muslim boyfriend, things become more difficult. Not because you are a bad person, because in your mind, the care and altruistic values are in conflict with the purity values. And that's the big problem of religious prosociality. So it is limited, conditional, and minimal. But it's not nothing. It's better to have this kind of stuff rather than not at all. To be also clear, this does not mean that atheists are not prosocial. This was not my point. But quantitatively speaking, there is more chance for a religious person in several occasions to act altruistically, prosocially at least, prosocially. Right. Now, when the atheist acts prosocially, it may be more altruistically motivated because there is no hope of reward in a paradise or fear of punishment, something like that. So it may be more mature or more intrinsically motivated as altruism in the mind of the atheist. Yeah, that's a bit. I hope. Yeah, most people would be happy with this kind of conclusion that it is equilibrated, I think. Yeah. Otherwise, it is as if we have to say for thousands of years we were all crazy to associate religion with compassion.
Right, but that's about prosociality. But on the other hand, many times religiosity is accused of fueling discrimination, exclusion, and violence against people that are not part of the same religion or non-believers. Is that also true?
Yeah, I would say it's not so deeply, inherently, heavily linked, let's say, religion and violence or religion and out-group exclusion is not, let's say, a necessary link, but historically it has been there, and also in traditional religious people and fundamentalist people's mind, there is a problem, that's for sure. And research shows that religiosity, even among religious people, implies several kinds of prejudice, not only ethno-religious prejudice, but this is less present in the secularized world. So in Western Europe, religiosity among Christians no more predicts ethno-religious prejudice. That was the case for traditional religion in America in the previous decades, but with regard to racism. Now, but when it comes to sexism, when it comes to homophobia, for instance, how we call it, sexual prejudice, yes, there is a big problem, and it's not even an issue of fundamentalism. Now, does this turn on to violence? Yes, sometimes, yes, not necessarily again. What it is clear, it becomes legitimation of violence. So it becomes a moral justification, legitimation of violence, aggressiveness, and certainly exclusion, social exclusion or discrimination, that's for sure. So there is a tricky stuff here, because you can compare, let's say, fundamentalism with fascism regarding to this problem. Intergroup conflict and racism and exclusion of the others. I think religion has an advantage and a problem there comparative to fascism. Fundamentalism has an advantage. So the advantage is that as in the religious discourse, there are also ideas of compassion, etc. You can work on this and then say to fundamentalists, come on, you are a religion of love, you cannot be violent. This, you cannot say that to a fascist. He doesn't care about love. But the problem is that once you legitimize this, let's say, exclusion of the others theologically, it's even worse. You are convinced that you are doing something good and holy, even if it is violence and death. So it's horrible on the other sense. Yeah, that's the situation, let's say. But if we see the development of things, there is a kind of attenuation the more you move to secularist countries. That's for sure. Yeah, yeah.
So, and what about the relationship between religiosity and psychopathology? Is it that religion can be a source of psychopathology, or does it tend to be rather good for our health and well-being?
Now I realize it's a nice question in the sense that we can ask that to French people and American people. I'm sure the American people, majority will say, yes, religion is good for you. Yeah. The French people who are not, let's say, educated in a secularist, highly secularist, and as we call that, laicity-oriented society, they will say, no, religion is more psychopathology since, let's say, 1 century or 2 centuries now. Let's say, first, if we take the average religiosity, so the everyday religious belief, practice, etc., overall, there is a kind of global positive effect in terms of happiness, well-being, self-esteem, not being depressed, having meaning in life, then overcome difficulties in life. That's the universal pattern.
Right.
And international studies show that this pattern is more clear when you are in religious societies, which societies at the same time are a bit dysfunctional societies, not because of religion necessarily, or not at all, but because they are more poorer societies with more social inequality, with more economic problems. So in these problematic, let's say, societies, religiosity helps terribly people because there are no other solutions. So this positive effect of religion on well-being diminishes or even disappears when we go to secular countries. Why? Because there are many alternatives. First, there is more social equality, social security, etc. And second, when there are problems, there are alternatives to, let's say, face with this kind of deprivation situations. So that's the well-being part, the mental health, the positive aspects of mental health part. Now, does religion create psychopathology? It would be excessive to say that. What it is clear is that if you have a psychopathological personality in terms of paranoid personality or in terms of schizotypy or this kind of stuff, dissociation, etc. Classic religion, as it is about big ideas, the universe, missions by God, etc., there is material there to help your to color your, I don't know, paranoia or dissociation, etc. So the religious ideas are nice candidates to fulfill the let's say the fragile mind with big missions, paranoid ideas, fear of Satan, conspiracy theories, etc., etc. Yeah, but it is not a causal factor. The only perhaps aspect of, I would say, psychopathology where perhaps there is something more inherently causal about religion is perhaps the excessive obsessionality, when it becomes pathological. So if you see, there was this nice series, Unorthodox, for instance, with this kind of extreme religious orthodoxy in Judaism. And we have this phenomenon in many religions. There is something there where religion does more than just providing ideas. I mean, it creates environments that amplify, yeah, I would say that. It creates environments, practices, ideas, close environments that amplify an excessive need for purity and then obsessionality and then a happiness, because these people, let's say, are not happy. They are suffering and they make others suffer. Yeah.
But even if religion is not itself a source of psychopathology, could it be that it still attracts, at least to some extent, people who suffer from certain forms of psychopathology? Like, for example, the idea of communicating with invisible entities or hearing voices is something that is very common among people who suffer from schizophrenia, and also related to some or many religious rituals out there. Some of them seem very obsessive compulsive. That is something that would have been developed originally by people who suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder or something of that kind. I mean, is that correct or not?
Yeah, no, it's a very good idea. You're right. I didn't mention before the idea of hearing voices, seeing things that don't exist, having the feeling that God or Virgin Mary is speaking to you. You see things that don't exist, or this kind of stuff. Now, this has been a bit more, let's say, the emphasis in the past century. This kind of extreme mystic-like experiences were more present at that moment. It's my feeling that now, of course, they exist, but it's very minority stuff. It's very isolated cases. It does not make a group, let's say, except perhaps in very, very pathological situations where a sectarian group becomes totally paranoid and then they are preparing to go to heaven immediately, etc., by making suicide, etc. But overall, there are, let's say, marginal cases. But even for that kind of cases, it's difficult to imagine that these people were, let's say, with a healthy personality, and then religious rituals or religious ideas or religious images came, and then they changed mind and they were attracted by pathology. So, as you said, the pathology is there, and of course you may find in religion beings that speak to you and nobody sees, and then you can convince others that you have superior powers. Yeah. Otherwise, it's very difficult in the secular life how to convince people that you have superior powers, except if you have much money. But then you should show that. You should show that, and then it's difficult. This is why I think the other part you mentioned, and I mentioned in my previous, let's say, answer, the obsessionality part, I think it's much more present. And then you have, let's say, perhaps excessive inhibition of sexuality in adolescents for this kind of orthodox religious groups. You have kind of neuroticism that it is there, amplified by religion across decades. Yeah, but this kind of, and this concerns groups and subpopulations. You can think of countries like Greece, Israel, Turkey, for instance, where these kind of situations are very present. But let's say the cases where, let's say, people are doing exorcism to be sure that they will get rid of the Satan, they exist, but it's, let's say, very isolated cases that they exist. It's nice for quantitative studies.
Yeah.
But we have only one life, and so I have not been very attractive personally in my research career to dedicate too much time on that. Yeah.
Fair enough. So I would like to ask you about one last topic, and you've already mentioned several times during our conversation secular society. So I would like to ask you a little bit about the effects or the potential effects of secularization. So is it really the case that over time religiosity has been in decline across the world, or even more so in secularized societies? And can we say anything about what might be the future of religiosity? I mean, should we expect it to be in decline in the future or not?
Yeah. It's a nice question, but it makes me, let's say, a bit, it puts me in a difficult position because Freud already wrote the future of religion is the future of an illusion. So what I could say today, it seems that as secularization increases, religion somehow decreases, not only from as a societal stuff, but also as an individual attitude and orientation. But at the same time, it seems that it is partly replaced by this modern spirituality. So it's so if we think in that way, I don't see a reason to say religion or spirituality will disappear. It will decrease probably, except if for its reason, for several reasons, secularization stops, because there are hypotheses or that some religions are more prone to fertility, and then if you think in that way, the very religious reproduce a lot, and the atheists don't make many children, so perhaps secularization will attenuate. Okay, so that's in parentheses. But if secularization continues, and there is also, let's say, this is a serious hypothesis because we know from cost-cultural psychology that individualism in Western terms becomes more and more present, so it's attractive to other countries. So we may imagine that society secularize. So if societies continue to secularize, it makes sense for cognitive special reasons, I think, not anti-identity reasons. That means openness to universalistic identity and seeing the dogmas as a bit too bizarre, let's say, the Trinity or the, I don't know, I will not enter now to concrete dogmas, but we understand religious ideas that are beyond, let's say, human rationality, something like that. All this stuff appear a bit, if not outdated, not so attractive or not so credible, something like that. So traditional religion may continue to, if not decline, to attenuate. But for the reasons I mentioned before, in terms of personality, characteristics of believers and non-believers, that means the people who are a bit more agreeable, a bit more conscientious, a bit more anti-materialistic, don't like individualism, wanted to feel that we are a big community, etc. These people may be more attractive to spirituality. It's not a necessary outcome of spirituality because you can imagine secular ways, secular humanism, to deal with these moral aspirations. But my feeling is that spirituality has in addition this kind of quasi-religious elements. There is some ritual, there is songs, there is symbols, there is the religious past, there is wisdom from the past, etc. And these are, let's say, ingredients that make a bit more spirituality a bit more attractive than secular humanism, at least for several people. Okay, so if we think in that way, I don't know, but I think at least for 1 century, more spirituality and with a religious flavor will always be there. But yeah, it's not sure that I will be there to see that too, or whatever I will be at that moment if I exist in some place at that moment. So it's easy to make this prediction, but it engages only me.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Saroglou, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Okay. You can just put Vassilis Saroglou, Psychology, Religion, and you can find the website in our research center at UCL-Louvain. I think it's psyreli.org, something like that, the webpage, but just put Saroglou, Psychology, Religion, and you will find the webpage, and then you can see the publication, but also summaries, short notes written for a broad audience. But especially, there is a small book published last year, The Psychology of Religion, that can be read in 3 hours, published by Routledge. And then Again, it is written for general audience, not for experts, and it may be nice to have a look if you have nothing more serious to do in your day.
Okay, great. So I'll be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. I was so happy to be part of this adventure, and good continuation to your work and exploration with others.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description box of this interview. And if you like this interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Herbert Gintis, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Jorge Spinha, Michael Stormer, Samuel Andrea, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Harl Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Antonio Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pablo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, João Barbosa, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringman, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, and Igor N. And special thanks to my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.